He didn't even leave cash for the appetizers. He just slid his damp raincoat over his shoulders, muttered a thin excuse about being in different life stages, and walked out. Nora was 31, a single mother, sitting alone staring at cold calamari. And then he sat down. The worst part of a bad blind date isn't the man. It's the mathematics. Sitting across from Greg, a regional logistics manager who smelled faintly of stale coffee and aggressive peppermint gum, Nora couldn't stop doing the math in her head. Mrs. Higgins was charging her $18 an hour to watch 5-year-old Leo. The Uber to this dimly lit, over-varnished Italian restaurant had cost her $24. The lipstick she had bought on a pathetic, fleeting impulse of hope at the drugstore was another $9. $51. She was $51 in the hole to listen to Greg explain the mechanics of his golf swing while he chewed his focaccia with his mouth open. The restaurant, a place called Trattoria Bellini, was trying too hard. It smelled of burnt garlic, damp wool coats, and truffle oil that was definitely synthetic. The table was slightly sticky under her forearms. She kept shifting her elbows, peeling the bare skin of her forearms off the polyurethane finish with a soft, pathetic schluck sound. So anyway, I told the guy you can't just reroute the supply chain without checking the overhead, Greg was saying, using a breadstick as a baton. He pointed it at her. You're in marketing, right? You get it. I'm a receptionist at a dental clinic, Nora said. Her voice sounded flat, even to her. Greg blinked, his pale eyelashes fluttering against the low candlelight. Right, sure. Well, same principle. Efficiency. She took a slow sip of her tap water. The glass was sweating, the condensation dripping down and pooling on the cheap paper napkin underneath. She was exhausted. A deep, marrow-level fatigue that only single mothers know. It's a tiredness that sits behind the eyes, heavy and dull, making the rest of the world look slightly overexposed. She had spent the morning scrubbing dried oatmeal out of a rug and the afternoon smiling at people with gingivitis. She just wanted a glass of wine, but she couldn't afford one if they split the bill. So Nora, Greg leaned forward, resting his forearms on the table. He looked at her, really looked at her for the first time in 45 minutes. His eyes dropped to the slight stain on the collar of her silk blouse, a ghost of Leo's apple juice from breakfast that she hadn't noticed until the Uber ride. You never mentioned what you do for fun. Weekends. You like to hike? I'm big into bouldering. I don't really have a lot of free weekends, she said, tracing the rim of her water glass. My son usually has soccer practice on Saturdays, and Sundays are for meal prep and laundry. The silence that followed wasn't just quiet. It was a physical vacuum. It sucked the remaining oxygen out of the booth. Greg's breadstick froze mid-air. Son? Yes, Leo. He's 5. Nora watched the micro-expressions ripple across Greg's face. Confusion, realization, and then a very distinct, poorly concealed terror. It was the look of a man who had suddenly realized the door was locked from the outside. He slowly lowered the breadstick. You! Brenda didn't mention you had a kid, he said. His voice was suddenly an octave lower, stripped of its previous bravado. Brenda is my cousin. She probably thought it wouldn't matter, Nora lied. Brenda had explicitly told her not to bring it up until the second date. Don't spook them, Nora, she had hissed into the phone. But Nora didn't have the energy to play the game tonight. She was $51 in the red. Right, no, of course. It's just, wow, a kid, 5. Greg leaned back, distancing his torso from the table, from her. He checked his watch. It wasn't a subtle glance. He pulled his wrist up to his chest. Look, Nora, I'm just going to be honest with you. I'm a really spontaneous guy. I like to book a flight to Cabo on a Thursday, you know. I'm not really in a place for baggage, Nora offered, the cynicism bleeding into her tone before she could stop it. He winced, pulling his raincoat from the booth beside him. Different life stages, that's all. You're great, really. But I should probably. I have an early meeting. The supply chain stuff. He stood up. He didn't reach for his wallet. He just stood there, awkwardly buttoning his coat, the wet fabric giving off a faint smell of mildew. The waiter hasn't brought the check yet, she pointed out, her voice dangerously calm. Right, well, the calamari was mostly you anyway, he stammered, stepping out of the booth. He offered a tight, pitying smile. Good luck, Nora, really. And just like that, he turned and walked out, disappearing into the rainy Tuesday night. She sat there, frozen. A waiter walked by carrying a tray of sizzling chicken parmigiana, the steam hitting her face, smelling of oregano and melting cheese. The low murmur of the restaurant continued, entirely indifferent to the fact that she had just been publicly humiliated and stuck with a bill she couldn't pay without dipping into the grocery budget. Her throat tightened. A hot, humiliating prickle of tears threatened the corners of her eyes. Don't cry in the trattoria, Nora, she told herself. Do not cry over a man who uses the word bouldering. She picked up her fork and stabbed a piece of cold, rubbery squid. She chewed it slowly. It tasted like frying oil in defeat. He was an idiot, if it's any consolation. The voice came from her left. It was low, quiet, but it cut through the clatter of silverware and the background jazz music like a heavy blade. Nora turned her head. A man was standing by the edge of her booth. He hadn't approached from the front door. He must have been sitting at the small two-top table, nestled in the dark alcove just behind Greg's vacated seat. He didn't wait for an invitation. He simply slid into the leather booth where Greg had been sitting moments before. Her immediate instinct was defensive anger. Excuse me, what do you think you're doing? Taking his seat, the man said. It seemed a waste of a booth. Nora stared at him. He was completely out of place in Trattoria Bellini. While the rest of the clientele wore damp windbreakers and business casual khakis, this man was dressed in a dark charcoal suit that seemed to absorb the ambient light. It wasn't just a nice suit. It was the kind of garment that moved silently, lacking the stiff rustle of department store wool. The crisp edge of a white shirt peeked out at his wrists. He smelled faintly of cedarwood and cold rain, clean and sharp, completely overpowering the lingering scent of Greg's peppermint. He had sharp, angular features, dark hair brushed back, and eyes that were a pale, striking gray. They weren't warm eyes. They were analytical. He looked at her the way an appraiser looks at a piece of antique furniture, checking for structural integrity. I didn't invite you to sit, she snapped, her voice shaking slightly. She was raw, embarrassed, and cornered. And I don't need a stranger's pity. I don't pity you, he replied evenly. He signaled the passing waiter with a subtle two-finger gesture that commanded immediate obedience. I'll take her bill, and bring a bottle of the Barolo, the reserve. The waiter scrambled away. Nora gaped at the man. I can pay for my own cold calamari, she said, crossing her arms over the stain on her blouse. You can, but you shouldn't have to, he said. He folded his hands on the table. His knuckles were slightly scarred, a jarring contrast to the immaculate tailoring. I couldn't help overhearing. It's a tight space. He was loud. You were remarkably restrained. I was tired, she corrected him. There's a difference. There is, he agreed. My name is Hayes. Hayes Montgomery. He paused, as if expecting the name to mean something to her. It didn't. She was too busy calculating the cost of a Barolo reserve to care about local socialites. "Nora," she said grudgingly. "Nora." He tested the name, his voice devoid of any flirtatious inflection. It was entirely business. "You have a 5-year-old son named Leo. You work as a receptionist. You are practical. You don't panic when embarrassed. And you don't waste energy on men who talk about supply chains." "Are you a serial killer?" Nora asked, deadpan. She tightened her grip on her purse, sitting in her lap under the table. "Because if you are, you should know my babysitter knows exactly where I am, and she's highly litigious." The corner of Hayes's mouth twitched. It wasn't a full smile, just a brief fracture in his icy composure. "No, I'm a businessman, and right now I have a massive problem. A problem I believe you can solve." The waiter appeared, practically vibrating with anxiety as he presented a dusty bottle of wine. He poured a splash for Hayes, who didn't even taste it. He just nodded, and the waiter filled 2 large glasses before scurrying away. Nora stared at the dark red liquid. She hadn't had wine that looked like that in years. It smelled like dark cherries and expensive leather. "Drink," Hayes commanded softly. She took a defiant gulp, expecting to choke, but it slid down her throat like velvet, sending a sudden, terrifying rush of warmth to her stomach. "I'm not a consultant, Mr. Montgomery," she said, wiping her mouth with the back of her hand. "I answer phones for Dr. Peterson. Unless your problem is an impacted wisdom tooth, I can't help you." "My problem," Hayes leaned forward, his gray eyes locking onto hers, "is my grandfather's estate, and a very archaic morality clause buried in a trust document." Nora frowned, the wine instantly making her bolder. "Is this some kind of hidden camera show? Are you trying to sell me a timeshare?" "I own the company that owns the company that built this restaurant," Hayes stated, his voice a flat monotone. "I don't sell timeshares. I am currently the CEO of Montgomery Holdings. Last week, my grandfather passed away. He controlled 51% of the voting shares. In his will, he left those shares to me on one condition." He paused. The ambient noise of the restaurant seemed to fade away, leaving only the steady, rhythmic ticking of the heavy silver watch on his left wrist. "He was an old-fashioned man," Hayes continued, "obsessed with family legacy. He believed a man wasn't fit to run an empire unless he was grounded by a household. He stipulated that to inherit the controlling shares, I must be married and providing for a family before my 35th birthday." He stopped talking and just looked at her. Her brain, sluggish from exhaustion and the heavy wine, struggled to connect the dots. She looked at his perfect suit, his scarred knuckles, the deep reserves of exhaustion in his own eyes that mirrored hers. "When is your 35th birthday?" she asked slowly. "Next week." Nora let out a harsh, abrupt laugh. It was a loud, ugly sound that made a couple at the next table turn and stare. She didn't care. The sheer absurdity of the night had finally tipped over into comedy. "Oh, okay. So you're scrambling. You need a fake girlfriend to parade in front of the board of directors?" "I don't need a fake girlfriend," Hayes said. The temperature at the table dropped 10 degrees. He wasn't smiling. He wasn't joking. "I need a legal wife, and I need a child to prove I am building a family unit. I need a piece of paper filed with the state, and I need a woman who understands discretion, boundaries, and pragmatism." He reached into the inner pocket of his suit jacket and pulled out a sleek black fountain pen. Then he took a crisp white napkin from the table, uncapped the pen, and wrote a single number on the linen. He slid it across the sticky varnish toward her. She looked down. There were a lot of zeros. A comical amount of zeros. "I am asking you to marry me, Nora," Hayes said quietly. "Tonight." Her lungs stopped working. Nora stared at the black ink bleeding slightly into the white weave of the napkin. It was $2 million. $2 million. She blinked, expecting the zeros to vanish, expecting them to morph back into the reality of her $51 debt. They didn't. Her heart began to hammer against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. Her hands felt suddenly numb. "You're insane," she whispered, her voice cracking. "You are actually, clinically insane." Hayes didn't flinch. He leaned back, taking a slow sip of his wine. He looked entirely at ease, a predator resting in the shade. "I am highly rational. If I lose control of those shares, my uncle takes over the board. He intends to liquidate our manufacturing division. 6,000 people will lose their jobs. I will lose my life's work. $2 million is a fractional expense to secure an asset worth billions." "I am not an asset," she hissed, slamming her hands flat on the table. The water glass wobbled, sloshing a cold wave over the rim, soaking into the paper coaster. She didn't care. "I am a person, with a child. You can't just buy a family at a pasta restaurant." "Why not?" The sheer audacity of the question robbed her of her breath. "I've spent the last 4 days interviewing women," Hayes said, his tone conversational, as if they were discussing the weather. "Models, socialites, daughters of colleagues. All of them either wanted real romance, which I cannot give them, or they were terrified of the legal constraints of the ironclad prenuptial agreement they would have to sign. They wanted the lifestyle, but they didn't have the grit to treat it as a job." He pointed at her, a sharp, precise gesture. "I watched you with that fool," Hayes said. "You didn't beg. You didn't cry. You didn't try to manipulate him into staying. You just accepted the reality of the situation and began planning your next move. You're surviving, Nora. I recognize a survivor because I am one." Nora felt a hot flush creep up her neck. She hated that he had watched her. She hated that he had seen her humiliation and decided it was a resume qualification. "My son is not a prop," she said fiercely, leaning forward. The smell of his cedar cologne was intoxicating, but she fought through it. "Leo is a little boy. He's shy. He likes dinosaurs. He cries when his socks don't feel right. He's not going to pretend to be the happy little heir for some billionaire's board of directors. He won't have to," Hayes replied instantly. The sharpness in his eyes softened, just a fraction. "I have zero intention of disrupting your son's life. The board doesn't need to meet him. The lawyers just need to see the marriage certificate and the adoption papers, which will legally secure him a trust fund of his own, by the way. You and Leo will live in the west wing of my estate. You will have your own entrance, your own staff. We will have dinner together once a week for appearances with the household staff. We will attend exactly 4 public galas a year. Otherwise, our lives remain entirely separate." He tapped the napkin with the pen. $2 million transferred to your account the moment the ink dries on the marriage license. Full health insurance for you and Leo, private schooling, and when the trust unlocks in 3 years, we divorce quietly, citing irreconcilable differences. You keep the money. You keep the trust for the boy. You walk away. Nora felt dizzy. The room was spinning slightly, the edges blurring. Her mind flashed to the stack of final notice envelopes sitting on her kitchen counter. The electric bill that was 90 days past due. The way Leo had looked at the cheap plastic shoes they had bought for him last week. rubbing his little heels where the blisters were already forming. She thought about the panic that gripped her throat every time she stood at a cash register, silently praying her debit card wouldn't decline. 3 years. "Why me, really?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. She looked down at her hands. Her nails were unpainted, cut short. There was a small paper cut on her thumb. You could offer this to anyone. Anyone would say yes to this kind of money. "Because of the stain on your shirt," Hayes said. Nora's head snapped up. She instinctively touched the dried apple juice mark on her collar. "You noticed it when you sat down with him," Hayes observed quietly. "You spent 3 seconds being mortified, and then you angled your body to the left for the next 40 minutes to keep it hidden in the shadows. You adapt. You solve the problem. You don't wallow." He set the pen down on top of the napkin. "I need someone who can adapt. My world is complicated. The press will dig into you. My uncle will try to intimidate you. I need a woman who won't break when the pressure hits. I need a partner, Nora. A business partner." She stared at the pen. It was heavy, made of dark metal, gleaming under the warm amber lights of the restaurant. She was terrified. Every instinct she had, honed by years of bad men and worse luck, screamed at her to run. This was a trap. Rich men didn't hand out millions of dollars without extracting a piece of your soul in return. He was cold, calculating, and viewed human lives as line items on a spreadsheet. But she looked at the napkin. $2 million meant Leo would never wear plastic shoes again. It meant she could quit the dental clinic. It meant she could breathe. For the first time in 5 years, she could just take a deep breath and know that the ground wasn't going to fall out from under her. "What about intimacy?" she asked, the word tasting awkward and foreign in her mouth. Hayes didn't blink. "None. As I said, this is a transaction." "And if I want a date?" "Discreetly," he said. "Nothing public, no scandals. For 3 years, you are my devoted wife in the eyes of the world." Nora slowly reached out. Her fingers brushed the cold metal of the fountain pen. Her heart was pounding so hard she could hear it in her ears. A frantic drumbeat drowning out the jazz music, drowning out the clatter of the restaurant, drowning out her own common sense. She picked up the pen. It felt impossibly heavy. "If you ever threaten my son," she said, looking up to meet his cold gray eyes, "if you ever use him as leverage or make him feel like a pawn in your little corporate war, I don't care how much money you have, I will burn your life to the ground." Hayes looked at her. For the first time all evening, a genuine smile touched his lips. It was small, dangerous, and entirely thrilling. "I believe you," he said softly. "Sign the napkin, Nora. Let's go get married." Her old apartment smelled of bleach and lingering cooking grease from the unit downstairs. The Montgomery estate smelled of nothing. It was a sterile, temperature-controlled silence that pressed against her eardrums the moment the heavy oak doors shut behind them. Nora stood in the foyer, gripping Leo's sticky little hand. Her sneakers squeaked obscenely against the imported marble floor. "Is this a museum, Mommy?" Leo whispered. He was clutching his plastic T-Rex to his chest like a shield. "No, Bug," she said, her throat tight. It's a house." It didn't feel like a house. It felt like a fortress. The legalities had been a blur of conference rooms, stale coffee, and men in sharp suits sliding thick stacks of paper across mahogany tables. She had signed her name so many times, her wrist ached. The $2 million had hit her barren checking account on a Thursday afternoon. She had stared at the banking app on her cracked phone while sitting in the break room at the dental clinic. the hum of the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead. She didn't cry. She just felt a terrifying, hollow weight drop into her stomach. She had sold her life for 3 years. Now, a woman named Beatrice, the head housekeeper, whose posture was so rigid it made Nora's own spine ache, was leading them to the West Wing. "Mr. Montgomery keeps his private quarters in the East Wing," Beatrice explained, her heels clicking a rhythmic military march down the long carpeted corridor. "You and the child will reside here. You have a private kitchen, a playroom, and access to the southern gardens. Dinner is served promptly at 7 in the formal dining room on Thursdays. Mr. Montgomery requires punctuality." She pushed open a set of double doors. The suite was bigger than her entire apartment building. It was done in muted blues and grays, with towering windows looking out over a manicured lawn. The carpets were so thick she felt like she was sinking. Leo immediately dropped to his knees, burying his face in the rug. "It's soft," he announced, his voice muffled. Nora walked into the bedroom. A king-size bed dominated the space, covered in crisp white linens that looked like they had never been touched. On the bedside table sat a stack of heavy embossed cards. She picked one up. It was a schedule, dress fittings, etiquette lessons, media training. Hayes wasn't just hiding her, he was manufacturing her. Their first Thursday dinner was an exercise in pure, agonizing endurance. The dining room table was 20 feet long. Hayes sat at one end, Nora sat at the other, and Leo was perched on a booster seat in the middle, looking like a tiny, confused diplomat bridging a demilitarized zone. The silence was deafening, broken only by the scrape of silver on china. Hayes wore a tailored navy suit, even in his own home. He read a tablet propped up against his water glass, chewing his dry-aged steak with mechanical efficiency. Nora looked at him, trying to find a crack in the armor. There was none. He was exactly the man he had presented at the restaurant. Cold, transactional, and entirely focused on his objective. "I don't like these green things," Leo announced suddenly, his small voice shattering the quiet. He pointed a stubby finger at the asparagus on his plate. Hayes looked up from his tablet. He stared at Leo. Leo stared back, completely unfazed by the billionaire's icy gray eyes. "They are high in vitamins," Hayes said finally. His tone was the exact same one he used to discuss supply chains. "They facilitate cellular growth." Leo scrunched his nose. "They taste like grass." Nora braced herself, waiting for the reprimand, waiting for the annoyance to flash across Hayes's face. Instead, Hayes reached over, picked up his own fork, and speared a piece of asparagus. He chewed it slowly, thoughtfully. "You are correct," Hayes said. "They are oversteamed. Beatrice." The housekeeper materialized from the shadows almost instantly. "Have the chef remove the asparagus," Hayes ordered, not breaking eye contact with the young boy. "Bring him the macaroni." Beatrice blinked. "Sir, the chef prepared—" "Macaroni," Hayes repeated, his voice dropping an octave. Nora watched, stunned, as her 5-year-old son successfully negotiated with a corporate titan. Hayes didn't smile. He didn't offer a warm, paternal chuckle. He just went back to his tablet. But a strange, microscopic knot in her chest loosened. The illusion of safety shattered the very next morning. Nora was in the sunroom drinking coffee and trying to decipher the intricacies of the estate's security system when the doors swung open. It wasn't Beatrice. It was an older man leaning heavily on a silver-topped cane. He had Hayes's sharp jawline, but his skin was mottled, and his eyes were a watery, vicious blue. He smelled strongly of gin and expensive cigars. "So," the man rasped, limping into the room and looking around with open disgust. "This is the stray." Nora stood up slowly, putting her coffee mug down. The ceramic clicked sharply against the glass table. "Excuse me?" "Arthur Montgomery," he said, not offering his hand. He looked her up and down, his gaze lingering on her cheap jeans and the oversized sweater she had bought at a thrift store. "I'm the uncle whose life you are currently complicating." Her heart hammered against her ribs, but she forced her chin up. "I don't know what you mean." Arthur laughed, a dry coughing sound. "Please, don't insult my intelligence, sweetheart. I've read your file. Receptionist, single mother, 3 maxed-out credit cards before last week. Hayes is desperate, but I didn't think he was stupid enough to pull a mail-order bride off the clearance rack." He stepped closer. The smell of the gin made her stomach churn. "He thinks this little piece of paper will satisfy the board," Arthur sneered. "He thinks playing house with a gold digger will secure his shares. But I'm going to have my investigators crawl so far up your past, Nora. You'll wish you never heard the name Montgomery. Every bad debt, every ex-boyfriend, every time you were late on your rent. The board hates a scandal more than they hate me." Panic, cold and sharp, flooded her veins. He was going to expose her. He was going to ruin everything, and she would be dragged back to the plastic shoes and the final notices. But then she remembered the $51. She remembered Greg walking out. She remembered the feeling of being entirely, utterly out of options, and the steel that had forged in her spine because of it. She didn't back away. She stepped into Arthur's space. "Go ahead," she said, her voice dropping to a low, flat calm. It was her customer service voice, honed by years of dealing with abusive patients, but weaponized. "Dig into my past, Arthur. You'll find I was poor. You'll find I struggled. You know what you won't find? A single thing I did that wasn't to keep my son fed." Arthur's watery eyes narrowed. "I'm not scared of you," she lied, the words tasting like copper in her mouth. "I deal with men who throw tantrums to get their way every single day. You're just older, and your breath is worse. Now get out of my sunroom before I call security and have you physically removed from my husband's house." The word husband felt bizarre, but it worked. Arthur's face flushed a deep, ugly purple. He gripped his cane, his knuckles turning white. For a second, she thought he might hit her. "You're going to regret this, little girl," he spat, turning on his heel. "Both of you." When he left, the silence rushed back in. Her knees gave out, and she sank into the chair, her hands shaking so violently she had to press them flat against her thighs to stop them. "You handled him well." Nora gasped, spinning around. Hayes was standing in the doorway connecting to his wing. He was wearing a gray tracksuit, the first time she had seen him in anything other than tailoring, and he was sweating. He had been listening. "How much of that did you hear?" she demanded, anger flaring to mask her residual panic. "Enough," Hayes said, walking into the room. He didn't look angry. He looked analytical. "Arthur is a bully. Bullies rely on the victim retreating. You didn't retreat. He said he's hiring investigators. Let him. He'll find nothing but a woman who clawed her way out of poverty to protect her child. The public will eat it up. The board will view it as a demonstration of grit. You are a highly sympathetic asset." "Stop calling me an asset," she snapped. Hayes stopped. He looked at her, really looked at her, for a long, silent moment. "Apologies," he said softly. "You are my wife, and on Saturday, we are going to prove it to the city." The dress felt less like clothing and more like a beautifully tailored reprimand. It was heavy emerald green silk that clung to her ribs with cold friction. The diamond necklace around her throat dug into her collarbone, a frozen, glittering dog collar tethering her to the Montgomery estate. Nora stared at the woman in the floor-to-ceiling mirror. The makeup artist had spackled over the dark circles of her chronic exhaustion, contouring her face into sharp, unrecognizable angles. She looked severe. She looked expensive. She didn't look like Leo's mother. Hayes appeared in the reflection, adjusting the onyx cufflinks of his tuxedo. He stopped, his pale gray eyes scanning her with the same critical detachment he used to read quarterly earnings reports. "You look," he started, his brow furrowing as he searched for the appropriately pragmatic adjective, adequate for the objective. Nora let out a sharp, breathless exhale. "Don't overwhelm me with romance, Hayes." He didn't smile, but the hard line of his jaw relaxed slightly. He stepped up directly behind her. The ambient cold of the massive dressing room vanished, replaced by the radiating heat of his chest through her thin silk backing. He smelled of rain-soaked cedar and stiffly starched cotton. "The press will be aggressive tonight," he murmured, his voice low enough to vibrate in her chest. "Arthur has spent the week leaking rumors that I bought a wife to secure my grandfather's shares. They are waiting for a crack in the facade, a flinch, a hesitation. So I just smile until my jaw locks? No." He reached out, his scarred rough knuckles brushing the sensitive skin of her inner wrist as he secured a heavy tennis bracelet. She suppressed a shiver. "You hold your ground. You don't perform. You just survive them." 20 minutes later, the town car pulled up to the Montgomery Foundation Gala. The sheer wall of noise hit her before her heels even touched the pavement. It was a chaotic barrage of flashing strobes and shouting voices. The air tasted of exhaust fumes and impending panic. Her instinct was to curl inward, to throw her hands over her face like a suspect doing a perp walk. Then, Hayes's hand wrapped around hers. His grip wasn't gentle. It was a vice. He anchored her to the asphalt, stepping slightly in front of her to break the physical wall of paparazzi. Inside, the ballroom was suffocatingly warm. It smelled of dying orchids, roasted tenderloin, and the sour, metallic tangs of ruthless ambition. Men in tailored wool and women in architectural gowns eyed her with undisguised predatory curiosity. Hayes was pulled away almost immediately by a frantic, sweating board member, leaving Nora stranded near a towering ice sculpture of the company logo. She picked up a glass of champagne from a passing tray, just to have something to do with her hands. He left the stray off the leash already. The gin-soaked rasp scraped against her ears. Arthur Montgomery materialized from behind a marble pillar, his watery blue eyes bloodshot and gleeful. He stepped into her personal space. His breath smelled heavily of juniper and old cigars. "You clean up incredibly well, Nora," Arthur rasped, his gaze dragging over her silk dress. "I'll give my nephew credit for his window dressing. But tomorrow morning, I'm filing a motion to freeze the shares pending a fraud investigation. The board hates a scandal. They hate a gold digger even more." Her stomach dropped into her shoes. An investigation meant lawyers. It meant Leo's face in the tabloids. Arthur reached into his tuxedo jacket and slid a folded slip of heavy stock paper across the linen table, stopping it right next to her champagne glass. $5 million, Arthur whispered. Untraceable. Tax-free. Nora stared at the paper. "You take the boy, you get on a plane tonight, and you file for annulment tomorrow," Arthur continued, his voice a wet purr. "You get your quiet life back. I get my company." She looked at the zeros. $5 million. It was absolute, undeniable freedom. It was a house with a yard. It was college tuition. It was never having to look at a price tag or deal with a Montgomery ever again. A fierce, desperate part of her wanted to snatch it and run. She was a practical woman. This was the most practical exit. But she looked up at Arthur. He was practically salivating. He assumed her poverty made her hollow. He assumed she was just a cheaper version of him. She picked up the check. The thick paper felt substantial between her trembling fingers. Arthur's lips curled into a victorious sneer. She didn't break eye contact as she held the corner of the check directly over the open flame of a votive candle. Arthur gasped, lurching forward. "Are you insane?" The heavy paper caught instantly. The flame flared bright orange, eating through the ink, smelling sharply of sulfur and burning pulp. She held it until the heat blistered her thumb, then dropped the blackened, crumbling ash into her untouched champagne. It hissed violently. "I signed a contract," she said, her voice completely flat, deadening the background noise of the gala. "And you don't have enough money in your accounts to make me break my word." Arthur stared at the smoking glass, his face slack, the veins in his nose standing out in stark relief. "You arrogant little bitch!" "Is there a problem here, Arthur?" The ambient temperature plunged. Hayes was standing beside her. He didn't look at his uncle. His pale eyes were locked onto the floating black ash in her champagne glass. He had seen the check. He had seen the fire. Arthur practically choked on his own rage. He smoothed his lapels with violently shaking hands. "Just welcoming the bride, Hayes. Enjoy your last night." He turned and vanished into the crowd. The silence between Hayes and Nora was heavy, dense with unsaid things. "He wrote that check in the coat room," Hayes said quietly, his gaze still fixed on the glass. "It was for $5 million. "I'm aware." Her adrenaline was crashing, leaving her dizzy and slightly nauseous. Hayes finally turned to look at her. The clinical detached appraiser was gone. His eyes were wide, searching hers with a raw, intense focus that made her breath catch. He wasn't looking at an asset. He was looking at her. "Why didn't you take it?" Nora thought about the $51. She thought about the crushing indignity of being powerless. She thought about the way Arthur had looked at her. "Because I don't run from bullies," she said, her voice breaking slightly on the last word. "And I don't abandon my partners." Hayes held her gaze. Slowly he reached out. He didn't offer his arm for a performative escort. He took her hand, threading his scarred fingers tightly through hers. It wasn't a gentle grip. It was a fiercely possessive anchor. "No," Hayes murmured, a dark, unmistakable reverence bleeding into his tone. "We don't." He turned them toward the flashbulbs. They walked forward together, entirely armed. Did you love Nora's fierce transformation and Hayes' icy exterior cracking? If this story kept you on the edge of your seat, hit that like button right now. Make sure to share this video with a friend who loves a good billionaire romance with a strong, no-nonsense heroine. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and ring the bell so you never miss a dramatic story. Let us know in the comments. What would you have done with the check?